Hey there, friends. Jeff Fritz here, and I'm back with episode 8 of C Sharp in the Cards. We've been learning about all the basics of getting started with C Sharp. Make sure you check out the rest of the series in the playlist. It's linked just below. Make sure you check out the website. It's going to be linked right up there so you can learn more about all the other lessons that we have. Get your hands on the materials like this notebook that we're going to be talking about and walking through today as we learn about loops in C Sharp. Now, loops are something that are pretty common in many different programming languages. And in C Sharp, we have these keywords for, while, and do that we're going to introduce and talk about here. There's a little bit more to for than what we're going to talk about today, but we're going to talk about using the for loop in its basic syntax here today. And when we think about looping and going through and repeating tasks, we're going to make the comparison as part of our lesson to dealing cards. When you're dealing cards, you're repeating over and over again. I'm going to give you a card. I'm going to give you a card. I'm going to give this other player a card. And you end up doing something that might be emulated with code that looks like this. Player 2 has 0 cards in hand. Player 1 has 0 cards in hand. And we're gonna have 52 cards in the deck. We're gonna take a card out of the deck and we're gonna put it in player 1's hand. We're gonna take another card out of the deck and we're gonna put it into player 2's hand. We're gonna take another card out of the deck and we're gonna give it to player 1, and so on, and player 2. And that's nice, and we can display how many cards are left in the deck at that point and how many cards each player has. There's 48 cards left in the deck, and we dealt 2 cards to each player. That might be nice for a game of Texas Hold'em when you're playing poker, but that was a lot of code to write to just deal out 2 cards each. So this is where looping comes into play, and where we can repeat ourselves and do the same tasks over and over again. So we're going to write a for loop, and a for loop in C Sharp has this basic syntax. We're going to put some parentheses after the keyword for, and inside the parentheses, it's going to have 3 parts. An initializer that specifies a counter variable that we're going to work with. A condition that we're going to test at the completion of each block of code that we're going to execute in the loop. And if the condition is true, then the code block will be executed. If the condition is false, it will stop. And then we're going to have some sort of an iterator that increments that initializer, that increments that value so that we can continue processing. So if we go back to that sample that we had of dealing out cards, here's cards in player 1's hand, cards in player 2's hand, and we're going to set up a variable called cards dealt. I'm using the var keyword here. You could use int or byte or short if you'd like, because we're only dealing with 5 cards each. We're going to deal 5 cards out. Typical game of 5-card draw in poker. And each time that we go through, we're going to increment the cards dealt. So we do that plus plus operator that we learned previously. Okay. Each step through, when we want to deal out one of those 5 cards, we're going to take a card out of the deck, decrement the number of cards in the deck, and we're going to increase the number of cards in player 1's hand. Same thing for player 2. We're going to decrement the number of cards in the deck, increment the number of cards in player 2's hand. So with this little for loop, I have the exact same display statements there at the bottom. I'll execute that again. There's now 42 cards left in the deck, and we dealt 5 to player 1, 5 to player 2. Okay. That was pretty easy for us to see how that works. But what if we wanted to do something a little bit different? What if we wanted to deal 3 cards to each player, right? Try these little tasks out. Update that code so that it lets you deal 3 cards to each player. Or maybe introduce a variable for the number of cards that you're going to deal and set the value of that variable to 7. And try that out and see if you get the right numbers popping up here. Okay? Now, you can even have for loops inside for loops. check this out. Let's update that sample code to introduce a for loop for a different number of players. Now, I know this isn't the most optimized code for this, but we're going to do this sample based on the things that we know at this point. So cards in player 1, 2, 3, and 4's hand, we'll declare those variables. There's 52 cards in the deck. We're going to deal out 5 cards to each player. And inside that for loop, we have another for loop. And for player equals 0, when player is less than 4, continue processing, and increment the player count. So take a card out of the deck. If player is 0, give it to player 1. Else if player is 1, give it to player 2. Remember, in .NET, in C#, the counter starts with 0 and our players start with 1. So we're going to, for player 0, give it to 1. For 1, give it to player 2. For 2, give it to player 3. Otherwise, give a card to player 4. Now when we go through this and we run and we look at our little status messages that pop up, that we added extras here for player 3 and player 4, each player got 5 cards, and there's only 32 cards left in the deck. We dealt 20 cards, there's 52 cards in the deck, 32 remaining. Now, that's pretty neat how we use a counter to loop through and give cards to each player. It's possible to create something called an infinite loop. All right. Now, this will create an infinite loop, what I'm going to show you next here. So, I've commented out this code. Remember, that's a comment. And if we tell it, well, keep counting while counter is greater than 0, you can execute this and you will see that it will just keep counting and it'll keep displaying values, okay? Go ahead and test that out, but be ready to stop. There's a stop button that will appear. Be ready to stop your notebook if you execute this code. This will never stop because there's never a condition where that counter is going to be false, is going to be less than 0, because we're constantly incrementing it. Well, we can stop loops with a break statement. So if you're running through your loop and for some reason we need to stop, you can just put the keyword break, semicolon, and it will stop your loop. So let's deal, let's say, 7 cards to each of the 4 players, but maybe we only have 20 cards in the deck. Well, we're going to be 8 cards short. So what we can do, we have that same code to start. I set the number of cards in the deck to 20, and I added a little if statement here. If the number of cards in the deck is less than 1, we dealt out all the cards, stop. Don't process any further. And if I execute that, you'll see we've dealt out all the cards, number of cards left is 0, and each player has 5 cards because we only started with 20 cards. Now, if I didn't do that break statement and we rerun this, we've dealt out all the cards. We've dealt out all the cards. The number of cards left in the deck is -8. That doesn't work too good in a game of cards now, does it? So, these things that you want to check, particularly when we're simulating something in real life, you want to make sure that that doesn't go below 0. Now, there is also another slight bug in this code. I'll put that break back in there. But there is another bug in this code. Take this scenario and see if you can fix this bug. What if we only have 23 cards in the deck? How should we modify this code to ensure that there's always cards left in the deck when dealing to a player, right? Because the way it is structured now, it's going to deal 4 cards and then check to see if there's any cards left. So how do we update to make sure that we always deal a card to a player and we don't run out of cards? How would you make changes to ensure that we always deal the same number of cards to each player? So each player gets their 5th card. Well, there's 23 cards. we should stop dealing because we've only got 3 cards and 4 players to deal to. We should stop at that point. How do we know and process and handle that? Give that a try. Tinker with that in the notebook in this area up here and see what you come up with. All right. There's also a keyword called continue. So if for some reason you want to continue processing the loop, but skip the rest of the content of the code of the loop, hey, go continue, go restart the next iteration through the loop, you can call the keyword continue. So I'll go back to that same scenario. We have 20 cards in the deck. 7 cards are going to be dealt out. And at the beginning here, I'll say if cards in the deck is less than 1. I put it right at the start. We've dealt out all the cards and continue. So continue will stop. We'll skip processing this code and come right back up to the top here. Let me show you what happens when this executes. We've dealt out all the cards. We've dealt out all the cards. 0 cards left in the deck, and each player has 5 cards. So we've properly stopped trying to give cards to the players and taking cards out of the deck because we short-circuited it and we called that continue. So it just ran through the loop again. Now, it's not entirely efficient in this case to run the loop again. We didn't really need to do that. Break is probably a better way to execute and process this logic. But I wanted to show you how continue works as part of this lesson. There's another way that you can build loops, and it's with the while and do keywords. They have the almost identical structure. They do very similar loop execution. The while loop will execute a test at the beginning of the loop to see, should I continue processing? And a do loop will execute a test at the end of the loop to see if it should run the loop again. Let me show you. So I'll take that same structure for dealing out cards, and instead of saying for each time through it, this time we can deal out all the cards by saying while cards in the deck greater than 0, 4, and there's our 4 for each player, each of 4 players, take a card out of the deck and give it to one of the players using this if statement, and we'll display then the number of cards in each player's hand at the end. I'll execute that. We dealt out all the cards. Each player has 13 cards in hand. Great! So in this way, we've written a little method that hands out cards to everybody. Now, I was testing based on the number of cards in deck. We can certainly change that, and maybe we say, let's make sure that while the cards in player 4's hand is less than 8, right? I could say less than or equal, let's say less than or equal to 7. And if I execute that again, we'll see cards left in the deck is 20. How did we get 8s there? I said less than or equal to 7. What happened there? While it had 7 cards in hand, it was still true, executed and gave them each an extra card. I'll show you one last trick here, and that's with the do syntax. Do syntax works just like while. Instead of saying while and specifying our test scenario right up top, we'll say do, bracket, and here's the code we're going to repeat. And at the end, we issue our test scenario. While whatever our test scenario is, the number of cards in the deck is greater than 0, and it has to end with a semicolon there. So it's the exact same thing. We just move the processing down here, and we include the do keyword so that it knows that this is a loop. And if I execute that again, we get the exact same values. We dealt 13 to each player because we dealt out all 52 cards. All right. So take a look, tinker with that a little bit, see what you think. Do and while perform very similar tasks. It's just whether you like to have the test run at the end of the loop or at the beginning of the loop. All right. Thanks so much for watching this episode of C# in the Cards. We've got lots of more episodes for you. There's links to the playlist of all of our previous episodes of C# in the Cards right over there, and a link to the channel so you can click through and subscribe. Click that notification bell as well so you're notified when the next episode is available. All right. Thanks so much for watching C# in the Cards. I'll see you next time.